Inclusion in the Global South. Basically, we are looking at what is really happening to the Global South in terms of access, information access, and what is really happening. We are going to have this entire panel discussion driven through some kind of data and evidences. Recently, World Bank has released a report looking at data-driven policy development. We are looking at whether we can make use of the existing evidences to come up with certain kind of policies which can change the people's lives. Right, this is what we are looking at. So my job is more of a timekeeper. It's said in Thirukural some 1200 years ago, it's written in an assembly of well-learned people out there. What is best thing to do as a wise man is to keep quiet. So my job is relatively going to keep quiet. I'm going to introduce this panelist, then I'll request Aisha to come. So when I introduce, please either stand up and show hands to the people who are sitting in the room. Aisha has an economics degree from London School of Economics. She's a senior research manager in LearnAsia. She'll be talking about the research they've done with two larger organizations in the world, looking at after access. She's going to focus more on Asia today. And we have Dr. Rajat Kathuria. He is the head of ICRIER, a very popular economics think tank based in Delhi. They're doing a lot of very impressive work. He has a PhD from University of Maryland. All right. The third we have is Nirmita Narasimhan, PhD from Delhi University. Those who are working on the space of persons with disability will know about her. She's doing a lot more work related to this stuff. Right. She has a PhD from Delhi University. And we have Anya. She's leading Internet Democracy Project in India. She's going to talk about things related to gender surveillance and a couple of other projects related to this particular space. Right, and she has a PhD from University of East Anglia. So if you look at this, they're very nice people, okay, working very hard in this particular space, well qualified as well. Right, with this I'll close the introduction. I request Aisha, you have 10 minutes, Aisha.
Thank you, Vignesh. Good evening. Hello. So before I start, I'll warn you, I have a lot of data, a lot of slides. I will not focus on everything. I will skim over some things, but you can always take a look at the slides later on. So this is based on a 18-country survey of ICT use in the Global South. So these, so first, LearnAsia, we work in the Asia Pacific. We're pro-poor, pro-market. We're an ICT policy and research and regulation think tank. The survey after access is of 18 countries in the Global South. It's nationally representative of each country of the age of the 15 to 65 age groups. We surveyed using structured closed-ended questionnaires. It's a face-to-face survey, basically. And in terms of methodology, just very briefly, it's, as I said, it's nationally representative. We go to great lengths to ensure that our sampling is done properly, and as such, we can extrapolate to the population with a margin of error of about 3%. The survey and the method is comparable across countries with slight variations, and I will also include a few slides on a survey we did alongside this in Nepal among 400 persons with disabilities. Again, it's representative but a higher margin of error. So the countries we cover are in this graphic. We look, so if you take the three regions, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, LearnAsia was in charge of the Asia surveys. Our partners, DIRSI in Latin America and Research ICT Africa covered the African surveys. Sampling, like I said, I'll just skip over this method details, but in India, I will focus a little bit more on India. This is the sample spread, so you just get an idea of what we're talking about. We talked to 5,000 individuals and households on various aspects of ICT access. So first off, in terms of connectivity, mobile connectivity, you'll see here, I'll just do that so you can focus on the Asian countries briefly. You can see there's a stark difference between the Asian and African. So the countries are ordered in in income, in order of income. So the highest income countries on the left side, going up to the lowest, down to the lowest income countries on the right side. So you can see there is some clustering. You have, Asia and Africa falling on the right side, and you can see connectivity varies. Mobile ownership, say for instance in India, is at 61% of the population that we're talking about. We'll also look at some of the divides, mostly in terms of urban and rural and gender, which we can do with this data. And here you see in each country the urban and rural connectivity plotted, but then you'll also see the blue line. So if you just take a minute to look at the blue line, which repeats in graphs further down, so you'll be able to quickly interpret it. The blue line gives the gap in connectivity. So in this case, for India, 22% indicates that rural India is 22% less likely to own a mobile than urban India. So that's how we talk about, that's how we calculate the gap. And you can see across Asia and Africa, we have gaps going up to 25%. I'll skip this because I explained it. Again, this is the gender breakdown. We have gender gaps, especially in Africa and Asia. India has the highest, 46%. So women are 46% less likely to own a mobile than men in India. Just taking a cut of the rural urban versus the gender, the intersections of those two variables, we see that rural women are across the board, across all countries, they are the worst off in terms of connectivity. Then we look here at income gaps, the gaps between high income and low income. Again, you can see Asia and Africa perform fairly not so well here. Smartphone penetration is, again, quite, I would say, poor in the lower income countries. India has 28% of mobile owners have a smartphone, 16% have a feature phone. So between the 28 and the 16%, those are people with internet-enabled phones. The balance, so the red part of the graph, that's all basic phones, so no internet connectivity. In terms of internet use, before we talk about use, we have to talk about awareness. Again, you can see Asia, Africa perform poorly in terms of internet access. In India, you have 35% of the 15 to 65 population know what the internet is. You can see Cambodia is pretty bad, just 11% know what the internet is. Then here, looking at the gaps in internet awareness, urban, rural gaps, again, the gaps are higher here than we saw earlier, 40% in India, going up to 50%, 57% in Cambodia. Then if we look at, the gender gap is again, I haven't got the graph here, but there is a significant gender gap. When we take internet use, again, you see similar patterns. 19% of Indians aged 15 to 65, because that's our target group, actually use the internet. So there's a gap again between awareness and use. Rural, urban, there are gaps again. Gender, there are gaps, 57% in India, 62% in Bangladesh. So you can see there's a huge problem here. And again, looking at the intersections, again, you see, it's not very clear, sorry. Rural women are among the worst off in this case. So you see where you cross the two dimensions of marginalization, things look pretty bad. Internet and social media use kind of follows internet use is what we saw, very similar levels. Again, looking at the divides, we see similar patterns. And the reason, so when we talk to non-users, internet non-users, we ask them what the reasons are for not using the internet. And largely in Asia, the problem is about not knowing what the internet is. And then also even if they know what it is, they don't really know how to use it. Looking at what people are doing on mobiles in terms of e-commerce. So we ask people, are you aware that you can do these things on the internet? So things like buying and selling goods and services. For instance, we gave examples, Amazon, buying tickets, getting appointments, transport apps, and so on, and micro work freelance apps. Okay, almost done. You can see awareness was not very great. Use was even worse. And the key barrier here is not knowing how to. So that was for buying. If we look at selling, again, we see the same thing. We see pretty much it's almost non-existent. So that was just a lady from our qualitative study, which Rajat will talk about. Looking at the survey of persons with disabilities in Nepal. So the gaps I'm just repeating in the red what we saw earlier, the national numbers for Nepal. So mobile ownership overall in Nepal was 72, but among persons with disabilities, it drops to 32%. And the main reason for not having a mobile, they say, is they cannot use one because of their disability. Second, they don't know how to use it, followed by they don't need it, and some say they can't afford it, and so on. Smartphone ownership is pretty low, which is as you can see here, 8% compared to 52% in the main sample. So nationally, 52%. In the persons with disability sample, it's 8%. Reasons are because they don't need one, they can't afford one, and so on. What they do on their phone, in terms of the level of skill, what they can do with their phone. There are some who can do certain tasks by themselves, searching, installing apps, creating logins, and so on. But there are also some who need help, and there are equally some who just can't do it or don't know how to do it. App use is mostly messaging and chat. The first, right at the top, if you see disability apps, they're only used by about 3%. So just similarly, internet and social media use, they lag behind, and I will leave it there with you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. I'd like to take the questions towards the event. Rajat, your turn. Please talk about the micro project. You can sit here.
I don't have... Thank you. At the outset, thank you, Vignesh. Thank you, Aisha, for inviting me to speak in this session. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did with Learn Asia and ICRIER on microwork and freelancing in India, the opportunities and the challenges. And the background to the work was that Aisha has already talked about, the huge digital penetration. Well, not the huge, but at least the perceived very large digital penetration in India, especially mobile phones and what people were doing with it. And when the study from Learn Asia came out and we presented it in the Habitat Center a few months ago, and I was on that panel along with the secretary of Telecom, and then Hilani expected that we would be surprised at the results, and we were not surprised because there is significant hype in the numbers, at least in the popular perception. When you actually drill down to the gaps are there. Rural-urban gap, the gap in sort of ownership, dual, multiple SIMs, etc. Now, if you sort of look at that as the background and look at India's labor market, where there's very large number of young people coming into the labor force and employment really being a challenge, especially productive employment. So I won't bore you with the sort of details of that, but the background of this huge hype of digital penetration, the actual numbers are a little sobering, and then the problems with productive job creation in the formal economy. And if you kind of mix these together, we thought, why don't we look at, what is the scope of online freelancing and microwork in the Indian context? And what are the challenges that one faces in this regard? So the motivation, therefore, becomes clear is this going to provide you with sort of job opportunities mainstream, or is it likely to be only supplemental? Are women more likely to do online freelancing, or is it going to be restricted to males? Is it going to be in the 15 to 65 age group, which is productive opportunities, or is it going to be more restricted than that? So these were the sort of research and qualitative questions we took to this survey of about 2,000 people. Naturally, it was biased towards, let's say, metro and people who owned digital means to actually communicate. So I wouldn't put too much sort of rigor or emphasis on the sample, but I think the results are fairly sort of reflective of the online freelancing sort of market in India. The hype that this market has received in Europe, especially in the United States, but the numbers are staggering. I don't know if they are true, but the numbers are staggering. 40% of the new entrants in the labor force in the United States are in some ways being employed, self-employed in what they call is the gig economy. But it's in India, the results of the survey don't show that. So what are the major results of this survey? The major results of this survey are this online freelancing and microwork market, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this sort of market. It's basically where you source the job online and you conduct the job, or you perform the task online, or you could also perform it offline. But you've sourced the job online. There are various models, and the report is available on our website, and you're most welcome to look at it. But the jobs, the nature of the task should be sort of sourced online, and you should be delivered online more often than not. But even if it's delivered offline, we've considered it as a sort of part of the online freelancing market. So given this background, at 2,000 sample that we had, what were the sort of results? Well, the major results are not very surprising. If we feel that this is going to replace sort of mainstream employment, then I think it's early to say that. Most of the people who are doing this sort of job are doing it as a second job or as a job which they're doing in the interim while finding a more mainstream job. So this is mostly students or people who are likely to be out of the labor force, have free time, and are trying to earn a little bit of extra money. What is the kind of work they're doing? Sort of data entry, translations. Most of the time, this is the sort of. But India is a big base for software and technology writing. So 55% of the people who are doing online freelancing in India, and it could be catering to the global market or it could be catering to the Indian market, are doing software and technology. And mostly it's being done by students in the age group, who want supplemental income while they're going to school or while they're going to college. Most of the time it's this. In terms of number of women, I don't remember the exact number of women who are who out of the sample, but it's a very small percentage of women. I'll conclude. It's a very small percentage of women. And I think the reason for this is our sample is, as I said, biased towards metros. And I think awareness levels are also low. So what are the sort of challenges that we came across? Companies are willing. So on the demand side, companies are willing to outsource jobs. It's not that they are not willing to outsource jobs. They are willing to outsource jobs. And the reason companies are willing to outsource jobs is naturally you are able to select from a larger pool of people, and you are often going to reduce transactions costs. So cost reasons is sort of a persuasive and compelling reasons for firms to outsource. But at the same time, you are going to get the ability to choose amongst the best people from the group or the skill pool to be able to execute the task. So that's from the demand side. From the supply side, the reason is, of course, as I said, it's not looking at it as a mainstream occupation, but looking at it in terms of generating supplemental income for students or people who are looking to find a job, a more full-time job later on, and for some people who are staying at home, women staying at home, trying to earn extra money. Why is it in mainstream? So the key question that comes to our mind when you look at this market in India, where, as I said, digitization is perceived to be very high, Indians are supposed to be very good at software, very good with technology. I mean, that's the prowess and the soft skills. Why is it that digital sort of freelancing and micro work hasn't taken off as much, even in the younger population, as it has in the United States? Well, I guess some of the reasons could be cultural. And one of the reasons is that it is not recognized as a full-time occupation in the labor market that somebody with some amount or would do this sort of task as a mainstream. So the stigma attached to freelancing is still fairly high in the Indian context. Even though, and the second point why this is not perceived to be mainstream is that it doesn't provide permanence. And I think culturally Indians are wedded, although in the younger generation permanence is not such an important attribute. So two reasons on the demand side why online freelancing is still looked at in a sort of, I wouldn't say in a negative way, but only in a partially sort of overcoming the job market constraints. One is the cultural factors, and two is lack of permanence. I'll be happy to answer more questions during the question answer session. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi everyone. So when I was in school, I remember giving my first Olympiad exam, and I couldn't see what the questions were. And I think I just did like A, C, B, B, D, E, B, C, A or something like that. And I got through maths, and the next thing I know, my name is coming in the assembly for a certificate, and I'm really bad at maths. And then I did the same thing with the law exam, and I got through law, so I had to study law. But I would have infinitely preferred to have, later on, as I now do, use technology to actually study the subject. When I started out, there were no technologies available which I could afford. There was some screen reader for $1,000. And I read only English, but for other people, there weren't text-to-speech in Indian languages. And we've made a lot of progress since then. I mean, there are technologies, but there's a need for a lot more technologies for people with different disabilities. You know, maybe if I'm a deaf person and I'm in this room, I would love a captioning software which is simultaneously picking up everybody's conversation and telling you what is going on. So I think about access, there are two things I'd say for access for persons with disabilities. A, ICT is, of course, an enabler, and I think more than ever, it's almost the only way to communicate nowadays. So you have to get that community in, and we have to get them plugged into society. Number two is access to the appropriate technology, and I think at least to some part in India we have had, and in some other countries slowly we have to look towards our own internal capacity to create technologies which are appropriate for us in our regional setting, which we can afford and we can easily use. Point number two. One is we have specialized technology, but the second thing is having had that technology, we should be able to access mainstream resources. So I have a screen reader, I have a mobile phone, but when I want to use an app, I want to buy something, it's not working. My screen reader says graphic, and there's apparently a graphic here which is not labeled, so it's not artificial intelligence as yet, it can't describe to me what it is. And that's a big problem which happens with a lot of websites and a lot of applications. So and with a lot of software as well, and so where does that take us? That means that there has to be something in when you develop technology, which will make your technology understand that. So there has to be interoperability, and there have to be standards which need to be complied with. Now in ICT accessibility, there are standards for most domains: websites, applications, broadcasting, telecommunications, procurement. So our governments need to identify these accessibility standards and make them mandatory. Unless they're mandatory, I don't think, they're not going to be complied with. I mean, even if they're mandatory, they're not getting complied with. So that which will take me to my next point about compliance. But we've had a law for 2 years now which says even private service providers have to make their websites accessible, or they have to make their products accessible, and they don't know about it. So a lot of companies which are creating software for clients abroad are doing 508 compliant, accessible, highly accessible products, but Indian clients are not asking for them. There's no demand. There's no demand because they thought there's no legal mandate, but there is, and they don't know about it. So awareness and strict monitoring and compliance. So if you look at one example, if you look at Ofcom, the regulator for UK, I really love what they are doing with broadcasting. They're sitting with people with disabilities. They got a 10-year plan. Every year they do research to find out what are the services which are most popular, which service providers are giving those services. And they're really working with all the communities to do that. And they're not saying we'll do it in 1 year or 3 years and we'll make entire India accessible, nothing like that. They have a 10-year plan, they're realistic. Another example is Korea. Every year they have like some 500 webmasters of government websites saying you get training. Every year you need to get training. Because you can't outsource accessibility. Somebody creates it's very common in our country. You get give your website to somebody, says, please make it accessible. It'll come back to you, and you'll start making it inaccessible again. So it has to be a continuous process. I'm running 5 minutes, so I will finish now. And all I want to say is that there needs to be a lot of capacity building and a lot of standards and strict implementation of policy which has to happen. Accessibility is not something which I would view in isolation. It applies in a domain. It's something which has to be applied everywhere. You need your health records to be accessible. You need your ATMs to be accessible. You need everything to be accessible. So it's not something you should view in isolation or exclusion, but in every context. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, no, I don't. I am one of those really digital people, so all my notes are always on my phone, which looks as if I am actually tweeting or something in between. I'm not. I'm paying attention. First of all, I want to thank Learn Asia for doing this study, because I think there was a real need for data that is actually nationally representative on this issue, and we lacked that. In a way, though, what the figures are showing when it comes to the gender gap is even worse than what earlier studies, I think, have indicated. And I also hope that now that we have a study that's actually statistically significant and representative, that we are going to start displaying the outrage that I think these numbers kind of justify, right? If you look at a gender gap in the use of the internet of 60% or 57% and of social media use at 60%, those are just whopping figures in today's days and age. And I think it really, we're setting up young women, we're setting up girls for futures of disadvantage if we are not going to address this, right? Any inequality in the future is not going to be resolved if we do not start addressing this gap. The question, of course, to start with is like, why is this the case? Why is it there? And in some ways, it's not that surprising. We see that there's been a history in the country of women having far less access to resources in general, land, property, etc. But the question, of course, remains why with such what seems a small thing and is becoming increasingly affordable, etc., etc. We've done a bunch of a body of work that looks at the intersection of gender and surveillance and technology. And I want to specifically talk a little bit about a study that we did looking at what happens after a panchayat issues a mobile phone ban. And why are these bans issued in the first place? And what came out of that research was really a very strong indication of how socio-cultural norms about appropriate behavior for women were really strongly shaping their access. Overall, what we found was that actually the bans usually are not effective, in that it's not as if, in many cases, young women would still get some access. There was, though, disagreement on this, and the more remote a village, the more removed from the main road, like literally, the larger the number of young women who would not have access. But apart from that finding, what we also found was that even though there were many people who were speaking against the ban, there was wide agreement on a set of norms around how young women should be using phones. And this was basically anybody unmarried. We did a qualitative study, and the research looked specifically at Haryana and Western UP. And so for all of these, for that entire group of young women, first of all, mobile phones were not supposed to be mobile. You look at your phone at home, ideally on Sunday. and when your family can look over your shoulder and see what you can do. There was a real strong expression of a fear of the spaces for privacy that new technology creates and what that means in terms of the breakdown of existing systems of surveillance that essentially at heart were about the control of women's sexuality. So a lot of talk was about, even from people, like we spoke to a social worker in Muzaffarpur who actually works on women empowerment and had many wonderful things to say. But one complaint she had was, you know, these young girls, they get a mobile phone from their boyfriend, and then chupke, they use it in the bathroom. They close the door. So this idea that you close the door, you want to have this conversation with us being able to listen. And then she said, chupke, that's always bad. So it was really kind of the entire construct was like this. Spaces for privacy for young women are bad. And the reason they are bad is because you cannot control their behavior anymore in the same way. And we could see very clear differences between what happened with young women, and what happened with young men. And those young people themselves could see this as well. We saw the same thing with social media use also. It was very clear that Facebook was a massive taboo. WhatsApp was supposedly more acceptable because you would be speaking with people who were already on your contact list. So if your family would be surveilling that, it's kind of thought of as more like a community we already know. But Facebook, the idea that you would actually be able to speak to strangers, and especially the fact that you could put up pictures which would then be taken and used for purposes that are not acceptable. And we often talk about revenge porn, but in these communities, having your picture as a young woman put on a Facebook group where strangers are commenting on how deep your neckline is and how your breasts are showing up under your kurta, that's already enough to ruin your reputation. As a consequence, young women also adapted their use and the way they spoke about use. And I think that's why also like after access, what happens then is really an important question, right? Because even college students we talk to, the girls are constantly emphasizing that they are responsible users. So I'm quite sure what we heard was normative, that it was not reflective of what they were actually doing, because that's not what we were looking into either. But we would constantly hear 25% of all mobile phone use is responsible and 75% is irresponsible. And at some point I asked, we had these focus group discussions with college students, and I was like, where is this 75%, right? Because the ones we are talking to are all responsible users. And that opened up a little space to have a more complex conversation, but you could see that there was a lot of fear also to say that even just like watching a film, right? So the uses that they flag are all about for school, to help parents, etc. Maybe one final point I want to make. The whole question of technology-facilitated abuse also played into that discourse. And I think there we do have a real challenge, because that's also realistic. In UP, there is a helpline that's specifically focused on technology-related abuse of women. They've had 6 lakh calls in 4 years. 5.5 lakh of those were actually about mobile phone-based harassment of women. I wanted to flag this because I think our responses to those kind of problems sometimes tend to be really protectionist as well. But if we continue to do that, we're actually playing into those social norms that are hampering girls from getting access in the first place. So I think it's really, if we want to actually start solving this problem, I think it's really important that we look at the intersection of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 10 minutes. The floor is open for questions, please. Please introduce yourself.
Haris Suryadi, I'm a freelance independent science journalist from Indonesia. I was just wondering why, for Aisha, why you didn't include Indonesia in your survey?
Right. We can take a few more questions.
Can I ask a question? Okay.
Yeah, we'll take a few more questions.
So when we talk about digital accessibility, we don't often consider the linguistic diversity as a big part, a big component that contributes to the accessibility. Majority of the government websites are available in Hindi, which is great. You know, it played part in the formation of this country. But we also have 650 languages that are spoken in the country. and only 22 of them are official. What happens to the remaining languages? And any of you can probably talk about that a little bit, how language plays a role in the accessibility and.
Okay. Yeah.
I had a question for Rajat. So you mentioned that not getting permanent jobs was a concern for micro workers in your study. Was there also a concern about not being able to get access to credit, to financial credit?
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shri, doing my PhD in Germany. Got a question for the first speaker. Just a part of your study on access, I was wondering if there was any section that dealt with use through intermediaries or intermediated internet access, or if that figured at all in your analysis, or how would you put that in terms of access? Yeah.
So one is related to Indonesia, second one is related to intermediary access.
So we didn't include Indonesia. We had, we had limited funding, and we chose countries according to that. We did actually into a year before, we did a survey in Indonesia, but we were not happy with the implementation. There were some flaws, so we don't really we're not looking at that data. Unfortunately, would have been nice. The second question on language,
Language, I request.
I think, yeah, okay. On intermediaries, we didn't ask specifically about that, unfortunately. We only, we asked, do you own a mobile or not? We did ask a question among people who didn't own mobiles if they also used a mobile. So I think that would include using it through other people or using it independently, using other people's phones independently. We did see some usage there, but I think by and large, mobile phones are more of an individual, it's more individual use compared to, say 5-10 years ago when we did our older surveys. We saw a lot of this shared access and everything, but not so much now.
All right. Thank you. Rajat.
Right. Yes, it wasn't, access to credit wasn't a major problem. It was there. We did ask the question. And the way it sort of interfaces with the workers looking for micro work or freelancing is that you need access to a computer, you need access to internet, and therefore you need access to some skills training. But most of the people in our sample, as I said, in the sample, limited sample, all in metros, and had access to sort of computers and had already presumably had access to some wherewithal if they wanted to engage in skills training. So access to credit is, I think, in a qualitative sense, if you were to look at the space of micro and small enterprises, access to finance is a big problem. And I suspect that our sample hasn't done justice to that question, because there would be people who would be offline who we couldn't interact with. This is a hypothesis which we could presumably test, who could do this for a living, or even if not for a permanent living, a permanent job, they could do this to gain some supplemental income. And there is other evidence, like around the areas of rural sort of arbitrage, pioneered by data. I'm forgetting the name. Harva. There's a company called Harva, leveraging rural enterprise, rural value adding. It's called Harva, and they did precisely. But they were the ones who provided the training to the women who ultimately became their data entry operators. So there was a platform that was able to provide the training and leverage the skills or create the skills and thereby leverage them in the rural areas. They targeted rural areas. So to long-winded answer to your question is that in our sample, it wasn't a big constraint, but I don't think you should take that as a reflection of all the potential freelancers not having that constraint. Okay, so I just also wanted to say one word about the this sort of language and access. We did a study in ICRIR, and we are actually doing a study for the government on the GLTD market in India, and so we're not going to go into 650 languages, but definitely languages are a constraint to access. The number of languages that you can see on the internet are going to be sort of limited, but certainly as a constraint to access, it is one of the important constraints in India. There's no doubt about that.
Sure. So I agree. Language is a barrier to access often, and in India more so. And I'm not even sure whether there's enough quality and quantity of regional language content in Unicode. Coming to the topic of persons with disabilities, again, there isn't enough technology even for the 22 languages. That's not to say 650 languages are not equally important, which is why we need to focus on developing technology ourselves in a regional setting, because we are not getting it from anywhere else.
Right, thank you. Anya, yes.
Just briefly, something that came to mind when you were asking your question is this study done by, I think, two professors at IIIB. They looked at caste and marginalized communities in Whitefield and Bangalore, and specifically at Dalit communities. And what they found was that actually even for the men, in terms of, say, getting access to labor markets, which was for them really important, mobile phones had actually not been really helpful. And in their sample, it was a qualitative study, but they spoke to some 300 people, I think. They found one person who had actually been able to get new jobs, like gigs, through technology. For everybody else, the fact that most of these jobs are still posted in English was a problem. So we're not even talking here about one of the 650 languages that are not listed in the Constitution, right? But even then, the barrier was too big. And what you then saw was that they ended up using mobile phones mostly for porn and entertainment more generally. And then in these communities, for women, the question was like, why would we want to use mobile phones? Because or the internet, that's all just a waste of time, right? And so it perpetuates that myth of like the internet is not for us. And I think, again, that's a really big challenge when it comes to language, that just, you're not going to see it if it's not there for you, right?
Okay, thank you. This is an open question for the panel. If you look at, say, 10 years ago, any research related to digital divide, the kind of causes, reasons, what you are citing here in the stage is more or less same. The technology has changed, but it's more or less same. But over a period of time, you have, the ecosystem is slightly changing. You have new companies trying to build this gap, right? Say, startups we talk in terms of. So if any of your work, whether any role played by these smaller private players are making a change, or in terms of language, or in terms of intermediaries or intermediaries?
So in the sphere of accessibility, not many small companies, although we do find examples of, there's one company called Vindhya who has like 1,000 employees who are only disabled, and they employ only persons with disabilities. Or there is a company called Here to Say which has developed, trying to work with the community to develop apps in regional languages. So we do find, of course, examples of these, but they're not enough. Obviously, we have a long way to go.
Okay.
Let me just second that and say that, of course, there's a big gap that still needs to be bridged. But if you compare it with 10 years ago, we are in a completely different paradigm. And the reason I say that is that there's huge competition on both the supply and the demand side. Look at the time when a service provider in India was a gatekeeper of what was available on the phone. I mean, the feature phone wasn't available, so naturally he or she was the gatekeeper. But today, on a smartphone, even then they were gatekeepers. But that sort of monopoly has been destroyed, because now you can access the internet directly. You don't need a service provider, so Wi-Fi has been able. And the regulator has also, put pressure on them so that they can't restrict people who can, want to show their applications on the service providers platform. So the service providers monopoly has been broken. There are a huge number of app developers, although I still think, I agree that their sort of business commercial situation could be made a lot better. They're still sort of exploited by service providers to the extent that the service providers can. But it's no longer the case where 70% of the revenue is kept by the service provider and 30% by the app developer. So I think that equation has changed in favor, much more in favor of app developers. And app developers have much more now opportunity to showcase what they're doing. So that's, the first big change. And of course now, and all the regulatory moves to try and increase penetration in rural areas. I think the gender gap is something which is proving to be a tough nut to crack, and I think Anja has provided a lot of evidence on that, and we also see there's a lot of evidence, and there's social cultural mores that prevent access, especially in rural areas, for women, and that's the next nut that I think we need to crack, because as at a very high level we know, the greater number of women in the workforce, the greater number of women in the labor force and working in companies, not only do the companies perform better, the economy also performs better. And there are numbers from the IMF to show that economies perform much better when there's gender balance in the workforce. And I think we need to not only get more women to participate, but also break this instrument of access so that they can become major participants in the workforce.
All right, I've been instructed to stop by 5. We are 2 minutes over 5, and thank you very much for your patience. A concluding line is, I think we need to move our discourse beyond the existing theories and discussions related to the causes of digital divide and women are not being able to access. Look at new ways of looking at it. A couple of pointers looking at the ecosystem has changed, the role played by the government has changed, the private players are doing things differently. We need to look at this. With this, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's our issue paper, okay.
You already have, no? I can carry one.
Somebody has left the diary. Whose diary is it? There is some notes.
Thank you so much.